So have you ever started reading the story of Pentecost in Acts 2 and thought to yourself, what the heck is going on here? There is all this noise and wind and tongues of fire and speaking in tongues, and I just don't know what's happening here. And moreover, what are these tongues of fire? I've never heard of this before. And what do they symbolize? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain what is happening in these opening verses in Acts 2. So at the start of Acts 2, we see that the believers are all together in the same house, and then this violent wind comes and invades in. And then we see the Holy Spirit descend and tongues of fire rest on each person, and they start speaking in tongues as the Holy Spirit enables them. So what's going on here? What does all this wonderful imagery allude to? What does it mean? Well, this is what is called a theophany. A theophany, and that is the sort of phenomena that happens when God reveals himself in our world. And so there's all these different types of theophanies in the Old Testament. One of the first ones is Moses at the burning bush. So Moses is walking through the mountains and he sees a burning bush. And out of this burning bush, the voice of God speaks, right? So we see this similar imagery of fire and noise in this theophany. We also see in Exodus 19, when the people encounter God at Mount Sinai, there is wind and fire and noise again. Likewise, with the temple inaugurations, these are theophanies in 1 Kings 8 and in 2 Chronicles 7, where we see this imagery of fire and wind and filling and noise, right? And then one final example is when Elijah is taken to heaven. Again, there's wind and fire associated with this theophany. So Acts 2 describes a theophany using this imagery of wind, of fire, and of a loud noise. And so the question is, well, okay, is this just a general theophany, or is it actually speaking to something greater? Is there a specific theophany that Luke has in mind here when he's describing Acts 2? Now, a lot of scholars will say that Luke is alluding to Mount Sinai, and they draw a connection between Mount Sinai and the establishment of the Mosaic covenant and Pentecost and this new covenant that Jesus established. Now, there is a pretty significant limitation to this, though, because in Luke 22:20, at the Last Supper, Jesus says, "This is the new covenant I have with you." And he's specifically talking about his death. So for Luke, the new covenant starts at Jesus' death and not at Pentecost. So if this parallel between Sinai and Pentecost is not convincing, is there another theophany that Luke has in mind when he's describing Pentecost? And I see the key to the Pentecost theophany being in this phrase, tongues of fire. Now, this phrase, tongues of fire, is used 5 times in all of the literature that we have in the ancient world. And so I'll quickly go through these and we'll start to see that actually this phrase, tongues of fire, is linked to the temple. So first, Isaiah 30, verse 27 says this: "See, the name of the Lord comes from afar, with burning anger and dense clouds of smoke. His lips are full of wrath, and his tongue is a consuming fire." Now, Isaiah here is describing Yahweh returning to his temple, and from the temple, Yahweh's tongue is a tongue of consuming fire, and that consuming fire is going out and defeating the enemies of Zion, the enemies of Judah. So this imagery that we see in Isaiah 30 is Yahweh returning to the temple, and from the temple, a tongue of fire going out and consuming the enemies of God. Now, the second time we see this language of tongues of fire being used is in 1 Enoch. Now, 1 Enoch is a non-canonical Jewish book written in the 3rd century BCE, so around 200 to 300 years before Jesus lived. And in this book, Enoch ascends to the heavens and he starts to describe the temple of God in the heavens. So in 1 Enoch 14 verses 9 to 10, he says this, "And I kept coming until I approached a wall which was built of marble and surrounded by tongues of fire. And it began to frighten me. And I came into the tongues of fire and drew near to a great house." So Enoch here is approaching the temple of God where Yahweh resides, and he sees it's built with marble and surrounded with tongues of fire. Likewise, 1 Enoch 14 verse 15, it says, once he's gone into this house, he then sees the inner court or the inner second house, and he says this, "And behold, there was an opening before me, and a second house, which is greater than the former, and everything was built with tongues of fire." And then finally in 1 Enoch 71 verse 5, we see Enoch again encountering a heavenly temple where Yahweh was residing, and he says this, "In the heavens of heavens, there I saw, in the midst of all that light, a structure built on crystals, and between those crystals, tongues of living fire." And so we see here that Enoch, when he sees the heavenly temple of God, it's built on tongues of fire. Now, there's one last time where this phrase tongues of fire is found in Jewish literature, and that's in the Qumran community's book, which is called The Three Tongues of Fire. And what it describes is how there were stones placed on the high priest's breastplate on his left and on his right, and they would shine like tongues of fire when they were discerning a prophetic word. So if the prophetic word was to be confirmed, it would shine on one side. And if it was to be rejected, it would shine on another. And so we see this phrase, tongues of fire, being connected with the temple. Isaiah, 1 Enoch, and the Qumran community's three tongues of fire all use this imagery to describe the temple. Whether it's in Isaiah 30 where Yahweh returns to the temple and his tongue of living fire comes out, proceeds from the temple, or whether it's in 1 Enoch where Yahweh's heavenly temple is built on tongues of fire, or whether it's the Qumran community's three tongues of fire where the high priest would use tongues of fire to discern the prophetic word. Each one of these passages explicitly links tongues of fire with the temple. And so this means we see in Acts 2, in the narrative of Pentecost, an allusion to the temple inauguration theophanies. So just as there is this language of fire, wind, and filling found at Pentecost, we also see that there is this language of fire, clouds, and filling in the temple inauguration theophanies of 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 7. Moreover, in 2 Chronicles 7, when the people see this incredible temple inauguration theophany, they respond in praise. And this is paralleled in Acts 2:4, where everyone that is being filled with the Holy Spirit responds with praise. And so we see in the beginning of Acts 2, there is this incredible scene being portrayed where God's eschatological temple, his end times temple, is coming down and resting on these Jesus believers in Acts 2. That now the believers communally together are the new temple of God. And this can explain actually much of the tension that we see in Acts 3 through to 5. How do we have this Jerusalem physical temple with this new eschatological temple? And if you read Acts 3 through to 5, you'll see that the main opposition that the early believers have is with the temple authorities. Again, there is this contrast being made here between the physical temple in Jerusalem and this new eschatological temple of God. So what is Acts 2 describing? What are these tongues of fire? Well, it's describing God's new temple being established here on earth. So let me know in the comments below, do you see Acts 2 as describing this new temple being established? Or do you see other allusions here? Are you convinced by the Sinai allusion? Or perhaps there's an interesting implications that we can draw out from Elijah and Elisha. Elijah, there's this theophany where Elijah goes up into heavens and the spirit that's on Elijah now goes on Elisha. And is that paralleled with Jesus right? Now Jesus has ascended to the heavens. Now is it this spirit that was on Jesus now on the disciples? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please click like and subscribe.